one of the guys who helps out at Oasis Church in terms of teaching and stuff like that. And I had a conversation with Katya, as you probably know by now. And we got together and we talked about how we could make this experience that we're all going through as a church a little more meaningful, a little deeper for you guys. By experience, I mean, how can we make the journey of going through this book, the story, this is obviously the teen version of it for you guys, how can we make that experience a little bit more meaningful for you guys? And so Katya's got a great plan ahead of her, she's got a lot of good thoughts, and the way I kind of take part in this is I'm going to help her out and help you guys out by going through some of those things that we're going over on Sunday and kind of going a little deeper with that. So, for instance, this particular week we heard from Pastor Ben and we went through Exodus chapters 3 and 4 where God is talking to Moses, okay? And it's really important for us as a church, and those are our leaders in our church, to let you guys know that as we're going through this experience, as we're reading through that book, the story, to remind you that it really is just a book, okay? It's not the book. The book is the Bible. So we want to encourage you guys as we go through these different stories and different parts of the Bible, we want to remind you guys that it's not the Bible itself. So hopefully as we read through these things, you will be drawn back to the Bible itself, and you will start to realize that the chapter and verse and where exactly this stuff is coming from. It's important to know as we try to follow Christ, you know, what we believe and why we believe it and where it comes from. Okay, so here's what I want to do to kind of kick this off, because we'll do a few videos in the next few months. Is I want to expose you guys to a small tool that I learned when I was back in Bible school that has really helped me personally in my Bible study time, and I think would help in this particular time as we walk through the story of the Bible, okay? And so before we go into the details of what we read this week and what Pastor Ben talked about, I want to show you guys or expose you guys to a little tool that I just mentioned. So here's how you can remember that real easily, this tool. You can remember these three simple letters, letter O, the letter I, and the letter A. Okay, and we'll talk about what those mean in a minute. Just so you know, this little tool of studying the Bible is not something I made up, obviously. It's something that actually I learned from this book, okay? Living by the Book is the name of the book. The author's name is Howard Hendricks, and I would highly recommend that you guys get that whenever you can, if you can, on your own. You can probably get it at the library. It's a pretty old book, or if you have the money and your parents want to buy you your own copy, get it on Amazon.com or something. It's a really cool way or help in terms of studying the Bible. So here's the main idea of that book, okay, and the tool I was referring to. When you read through the Bible, and particularly in this passage in Exodus chapter 3, you want to get into a habit of using these three things, okay? And the first one for O is observe, or observation, okay? Observation. You want to get in the habit of, as you read through a passage, observing the details of what's going on in that particular sequence or situation in the Bible. Okay, so in this particular case, we went through Exodus chapter 3, and what we observe, what we notice, is that there's a simple guy, his name is Moses, very ordinary person, and an extraordinary, not so simple, complex, amazing God having a conversation, okay? It's the famous story of God talking to Moses through the burning bush, right? Now, we all have heard that before, and we know that it's cool and all, but when we look at the details of it and we follow this, we try to observe, we might want to kind of take a slow down and realize that there's certain things in that story that can jump out at us if we are purposeful in trying to observe those things. So when you read the Bible, in particular this particular passage, you want to look for things that are emphasized in the passage itself. You want to look for words or phrases that are repeated. Okay, so like in this particular case with God and with Moses, God is constantly asking Moses to do something for him. He's saying, you know, I want you to do this. I want you to do that. And another thing that's being repeated is Moses' reply. In fact, he's not saying the same exact thing, but the general response that Moses is giving to God is, but not me, I can't do this. You know, at one time he says, I don't speak well. One time he says, what if the people don't believe me? And he's making excuse after excuse. That's an important observation to make in this particular passage. Here's the almighty, everlasting God talking to a simple guy, and he's got a lot of excuses to make, you know. We'll talk about why that's an important observation in a minute. So as you read this passage, observe details. Okay, what's emphasized? Like I said, what's repeated? What's going on? You know, where are they? These guys are in the middle of nowhere. You know, why does God choose to speak to Moses then? He could have spoke to him when he was in front of other people. Things like that you want to observe, okay? Just facts about the story that's going on. Another thing that you want to do after you observe the basic details of what's going on in this situation is you want to go from observing all that stuff to figuring out, okay, now what did I see, what's going on there? The other question to ask is, what does it mean? Okay? So with observation, the question we're asking is, what do I see? Who's speaking to whom? And, you know, where are they? What kind of conversation is it? Or in other passages, it could be like, you know, what kind of book is this? Proverbs is a book of poetry, you know. And so we're going to read that a little bit differently than we would the New Testament. And when Paul's writing his writings, those are letters, you know, from one person to another. Things you want to observe, things you want to notice about what's going on in the Bible passage. Number 2 is interpretation, okay? Oh, that's a bad N. Interpretation. Sorry for those of you guys who are a lot, you know, like girls especially, you write really neat. I don't write so neat, but it means interpretation. That's what it says, okay? After you observe these things in the Bible passage, you want to start to interpret, or in other words, observation was, what do I see? The question you want to answer now is, what does it mean, okay? Very important that you guys realize that when we read the Bible, there is one meaning. There's not multiple meanings to what's going on in the Bible, okay? What there are many of is here, we'll talk about that in a minute, applications, okay? But there's really only one meaning, one interpretation to Bible passages, to what's going on in the Bible. So, for instance, with what's going on here in Exodus chapter 3, it's not that deep. It's not that complicated. What's the meaning? The meaning is God is awesome. He's asking Moses to trust him. And when Moses does, if you read the whole story through, God does amazing stuff when you trust him. That's the meaning of Exodus, okay? God is trying to accomplish an amazing thing, in this particular case with Moses, that what we find out later is actually just a small example of his intentions for everyone, not just Israel, the nation of Israel. It's God's intentions for everyone, which is to be their Savior, okay? To come in to the world where people are being oppressed and they're slaves to sin, just like the Israelites were slaves to the Egyptians, and to free them from that by using a particular deliverer, okay? In this case, it's Moses, but ultimately it's Jesus Christ. And so God is kind of painting a little picture with this example of what ultimately his plan is. So that's the meaning of what's going on here. We've observed those particular things about who this is being talked to, who's talking to him, you know, where they are, stuff like that, what's being repeated and so forth. And then we're talking about what does it mean? You know, what is the point of the story? The point is obey God, like Moses did. The point is when you do that, God can do amazing things, because the power and the ability to do things come from God and not from us. Okay? That's what it means. So then finally we move on to our last one, which is application. Okay? Application. That's when we take what the Bible is telling us, we look at the story, and we say, okay, now that I observed all these things, and if you're like me, you're wondering, what was the point of that? What was the point of observation? We're going to get to that in a minute. We know what it means. Okay, God is doing something, and this is what he's trying to do with this particular person at this particular time. How do I apply that? How do I apply that to my life? Okay, that's where you get the payoff of doing all this other work. Okay, here's what I mean by that. This particular passage in Exodus chapter 3 and 4 with Moses. We observed that Moses was by himself when God talked to him, right? Interesting note. I wonder sometimes, and maybe you wonder, is that usually when God speaks more clearly to us? When we're alone. That doesn't necessarily mean that he always does that, but in this particular case, it's something we can draw from that story based on our observation. sometimes when we're alone with God, in our bedroom, in our prayer closet, if you want to call it that, whatever, that's kind of a time when God really speaks a lot more clearly to us. Because we're alone, we can focus a lot more, we can listen a lot more, and it's a cool time. It's a cool thing to remember. Something we can apply from this passage, we can probably learn from that observation of God being alone is maybe we should make time to be alone with God too. Maybe that's our burning bush moment. Maybe God will reveal something to us. Okay? That's why it's important to observe. What else did we observe? That there was a back and forth in the conversation between God. God was saying, do this, and Moses was like, I don't want to do that. You know what I mean? I mean, think about it. God was saying, listen, I want you to go to not only the king of this nation, Pharaoh, but he's also kind of worshipped as God, and tell him what to do. Crazy, right? Because you're like, I ain't going to do that. He's probably going to kill me or something. Very difficult thing, very extraordinary thing that God was asking this ordinary man to do, okay? Why is it important to observe that, to write that down when we read through that passage? Because maybe there's something we can apply. Maybe there's something we can learn from that. Maybe God is putting something on your heart that maybe it doesn't mean life and death like this, but it definitely might seem that way socially. I'm not going to say that to that person. I mean, I'll be totally made a fool out of. It'll be really hard to keep my friends. Really hard to kind of show my face anywhere because that's embarrassing. I'm not going to say that to that person or do this thing. It's going to put me out there and expose me. I don't really want to go down that route. Maybe in a similar way, God is doing that with you like he was with Moses, okay? Another thing we observed when we talked about Moses here is that he kept making excuses. And he kept saying, well, I can't do this, and I'm not qualified, and I don't speak well, and stuff like that. Again, we observed that, we wrote it down, and now that we're down here in application, we might be able to kind of apply just a small little thing, not the whole meaning of the passage, but just apply that to our lives and go, maybe I do that too. Maybe I make excuses to God too. And it's cool because when we do these tools, we find the Bible is so much more relatable, so much more real than we really thought before. Okay, so my time is pretty long right now, and I got to cut it short. But I wanted to expose you guys to why it's important to observe when you're reading the Bible, all the detail of what's going on in that particular passage, to interpret it, make sure you know what it means, and there's only one meaning for it, okay, and then to apply it, to use these different things and try to apply what we've learned. So here's the gist of by doing this process, what we've learned that's more than just what we heard on Sunday, okay? Maybe God is going to talk to us when we're having our burning bush moment, when we're alone. Maybe we react to it with doubt and with second thoughts, and we're like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that or anything. And then what we read further in that passage, another thing we observe is that God gave Moses help. He sent his brother Aaron to go with him to speak to the Israeli nation. Maybe God's going to do that with us too. So maybe when God puts something on our heart and we kind of wrestle with it, maybe we can draw from this scripture that we should start sharing with people, hey, listen, this might sound crazy to you, but I feel like God's telling me to do this, or maybe God's kind of giving me an opportunity to do that or the other, okay? And just like God used Aaron to help Moses, maybe God has your brother or your sister or your parents or your friend to come alongside you and get that thing accomplished, okay? So what have we done? We've gone to a passage that we went through on Sunday with Pastor Ben, and what the general story is, right? Remember, interpretation, general meaning is God's awesome. It wasn't about Moses. God delivered his people because he was painting a picture and doing some things to point toward Christ. That's the most important thing. But when we kind of take it a step further and get a little deeper, we realize there's other things I can learn in this passage about myself, about how I can apply the Bible to my life. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I'll be talking to Katya more, and we'll kind of go through this again next time we go through another story in the Bible. And I wanted to show you this because it's important that you guys know the process that I've gone through in terms of studying the Bible. It's a real simple process. And what you can do, no matter what your age is, from 12 to 13, 14 on to 20, whatever, 30 or 50, 100, you can follow the simple process to not only get the general story of the Bible, but to learn how to apply the Bible in a way that really affects our everyday choices and decisions. So hopefully that made sense to you. And if it didn't, sorry, I tried, and we'll talk soon. All right? Bye-bye.